So I'm not a great swimmer. Christine and the girls, my wife Christine and the girls, love swimming, are brilliant swimmers. But if we go on holiday, they enjoy ploughing up and down, having games, etc. And I have to stay within my depth, or if I'm out of my depth, I need to be near the side. But I think it's great fun to try and draw me out of my safety and comfort zone. So the story that I want to look at today, the account of the person called Jonah I want to look at today, is absolutely terrifies me. Some of you will know that the story of Jonah, the account of his life, involves being thrown into the sea. That would just be horrific and terrify me. Jonah was a prophet. In other words, he was a man that listened to the voice of God, heard the voice of God. He lived between 750 and around 800 BC in Israel. And he was called by God. He had this message and a stirring within his heart to go to the city of Nineveh, which is actually just on the outskirts of modern day Mosul in northern Iraq. And he was called to go there because the country of Israel was at that point in conflict with the Assyrian Empire, whose capital at that point was Nineveh. So I want to look at this passage this morning. I guess if I think about what this message is about, it's really about storms. The question is, how do we face storms? And do we think that God brings storms across our path, or do we think they come from an evil place? Or could it be that they come from both places? How do we cope with the fact that storms come across our path? Some people have been asking, is this coronavirus a thing that comes from God? Where does it come from? Or is it a judgment from God? Or where does it come from? I think there are some lessons that we can learn from this passage this morning about how we deal with storms and sometimes where they come from. So let's read the passage in Jonah. It's a small book in the Bible, in chapter 1, starting at verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all of this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" As the sailors are questioning Jonah, he is very reflective. But the truth is that Jonah was the one that was running away. In fact, it says he ran away, and the word literally means bolted. God asked him to go to one particular place, but he bolted in the opposite direction. Tarshish is an uncertain place. We're not exactly sure where it is, but it's likely that it was either in Sardinia, just off Italy, or perhaps in southern Spain. Tarshish is recorded in early writings as being one of the places where wealth was brought and jewels and gold was brought for the building of Solomon's temple. So it had a place of great significance in Jewish history. Its precise location today is not really known to us, but it was a place that Jonah used one of the ships, the trading ships, to go to. And he heads for at great speed, bolted, it says, to Tarshish. Tarshish. That's a difficult word to say. I guess he's going in the opposite direction. It's actually quite literally the opposite direction from Nineveh or from Mosul. He was heading in the opposite direction, and really he had a heart of disobedience. He was wanting to go in the opposite direction from where God had called him. But disobedience has many steps. So first of all, he heads to the harbour, then he looks for a boat, then he buys the ticket, then he gets on board, and then the boat sails. Disobedience didn't come just immediately. It was a progression. And the same is true in our lives. Disobedience often is not an overnight thing. There's a progression of steps that lead us to be in a position where we're disobeying God. And he arrived at that place of the storm in the middle of the sea with the sailors asking him, what's going on? Where are you from? Why are you heading that place? But it had taken a number of steps before he'd arrived at that place. In fact, it's really interesting that although he was being disobedient, going in the opposite direction, he was at complete peace. It says that he was asleep in the bottom of the boat. The captain comes down to him, has to wake him, to ask him, what's going on? Why are you sleeping when all this turmoil is going on around him? So one of the first things I want to say is that when we're at peace, it's not necessarily a measure that we're in the right place. Sometimes people have this misunderstanding that if I'm at peace about something, it must be right. But in Proverbs in the Bible, it also says, to confirm this point, that there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. We can think that we're at peace. We can convince ourselves that all is well because that's what we want to believe. But actually we can be heading in completely the wrong direction. Just because you feel at peace about something doesn't mean that you're in the right place. You could be just being deceived by your circumstances. The captain interrogates him and he answered, I'm a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. This terrified them and they asked, what have you done? They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, the men did their best to row back to the land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. It's an incredible account of this journey that Jonah is on. And he'd arrived at this place of being in the ship that was caught up in the storm in the middle of the sea because of his disobedience in trying to go the opposite direction from the direction he should have gone in, literally the opposite direction. And so disobedience, though, didn't just happen by one choice, by one step, one decision. It was a sequence of things that led him to be in this place in the middle of the storm, facing this crisis in his life. He'd gone to the harbour, he'd looked for a boat, he'd bought a ticket, he'd boarded the boat, it then set sail. There's a whole series of moments where he could have taken a different path, but he continued in this path of going in the opposite direction, in heading in a way which ultimately potentially could have led for his destruction, or was leading to his destruction. He said, throw me in, to the sailors. Rather than repent and be sorry for what he'd done or turn around, he would rather die than start to repent and be sorry. But the men didn't want to harm him, so they work out, can we row to shore? They try and save his life by rowing to shore as best they can, but the storm gets even greater. It's impossible for them. And it really indicates something about Jonah's heart, that he would place them in danger. He, rather than be sorry for what he's done, there's just that continuing in disobedience. Does God allow or send storms? I guess the big question that we see in this, or the big lesson that we see in this particular story, this account, is that clearly God did send a storm. He sent a storm to get Jonah's attention, to focus him on the fact that he was walking in the opposite direction, or sailing in this case, in the opposite direction from the direction God had asked him to go. Sometimes God will send storms into our lives, into your life, to get your attention. Sometimes it's to give people a second chance. Ultimately, though, any storm that comes, God will always use it for good, for his purpose. Not all storms come from the enemy or from an evil place, but God will use every situation to bring about goodness from it. People are asking the question about this coronavirus. Does it come from God? Is it God's judgment on the earth because of the way that we've lived and the values and things that we've lived by, or the way that we've treated the physical planet? Did God bring about this as a judgment? And there is no simple, straightforward answer to that, except that we can know that God is not taken by surprise. He's not taken by surprise by anything, let alone this virus. God is all-knowing and all-powerful. And so when something like this comes, it doesn't come without his knowledge or his awareness. It doesn't mean he necessarily brings it, but he will not allow it to bring about badness that ultimately is not good. He will always bring some good out of it. And maybe you're listening to this message about obedience and turning to God and being challenged and questioning the values that you've placed in your life. You're listening simply because you are in lockdown and that you wouldn't otherwise be going to a church, you wouldn't otherwise be listening to a message. For some of you, that maybe is the case. But for all of us, this virus is bringing us to a sense of reevaluation about what do we value most in our lives. But the truth about this is that God is going to always bring something good out of it, of greater purpose than we can currently see at this moment. Let's continue with the story about Jonah. The account here continues this way. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. This is an incredible account of this man being thrown into the sea and being swallowed by, as it's described, a great fish. I guess we would imagine like a whale. Perhaps you might have heard of this with your children or as a child, this story. And it maybe sounded a bit like a fairy tale, like a fable, like an allegory of some description. But the question is it true? Well, Jesus himself refers to this account of this man. And so I believe it is true. I believe that this really did happen, that Jonah really did experience this, being thrown into the sea, and then the being swallowed by this great fish. Jesus' incident, interestingly, refers to this incident when speaking about the way that he would die at Easter, that he would be buried in a tomb for 3 days and rise again. He uses this description of the events that Jonah went through as a parallel, if you like, as a prophetic insight into the nature of Jesus' death and resurrection. That's really interesting. Let's hear what Jonah then describes. After the event, after these things have happened, he pens a song, a psalm, like a poem, describing the nature of this incident for him. And if you just imagine him being thrown into the water and the seaweed entangling him and him being swallowed by the fish, you imagine the picture of that as we read the words that he wrote. Chapter 2, verse 2, he says, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deeps surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. To the roots of the mountain I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. You know, when we reach the bottom, when we reach the end of ourselves, when we've come to the end of understanding what life is about, or asking the questions, what's life all about? What am I doing here? Then at that place, God is listening for your cry. He's listening for your prayer, listening for your voice. Jonah was there at the depths, at the bottom of the sea. But in the silence of his heart, when he just cries out to God, God is listening, and then performs this amazing miracle of bringing the fish up, and he's thrown up, vomited out, it says, onto the beach. Not a great picture, but much better for Jonah than the alternative. He's vomited out onto the dry land. And maybe you've come to a place, maybe you're listening to this today, and you've come to that place of asking the questions and not knowing what it's all about, and you're at the depths of yourself. You don't really understand. There's not much that you can do to project the life that you would want to have for the future. You've come to the end of yourself, and that's at the point when God is listening for you. He's listening to your cry, for your prayer. And if you are in that place, then why don't you just ask him to show himself, to show that he's real. Say, God, I'm at the end of myself. I want to know that you're there. Show me that you're real, so that I can learn about you, to follow you. And as you do that, let's see what God does for you. He's interested. He's listening for your voice. He's just waiting to hear your voice. When Jonah is thrown up onto the beach, to find out what happens next, you need to come back for part 2 next week. But the truth is that when you're facing storms, often they can be about getting your attention. And maybe today, God has got your attention. So why don't you call out to him? He's listening.